Okay, welcome everyone to the academic language presentation on purpose, claim, tone, and bias. Please make sure you have out paper and pencil so that you can take some notes. It will also be a good idea to have your RAF article out, The Lost City That Isn't, because I will be using that article as an example. Also, it's a good idea to have your blue sheet for the RAF article as well as your rhetorical analysis worksheet that you did for the RAF article, and you'll start to see how everything is connected. So have all those resources out and then we'll get started. Okay. First, we're going to talk about author's purpose. Another way to name that in the academic jargon way is modes of discourse. And modes of discourse are just like different ways that writers write. Okay, so when they are going to write an essay or an article, they have one of these four purposes in mind as their primary purpose, but please know that they might use a combination of these different purposes in order to accomplish whatever their goal is. And remember, that connects to the rhetorical analysis worksheet. When you think of the goal of a text, an author will have that. He has his audience in mind when he creates his purpose, right? And so that will help him know the different modes he'll need to use in order to accomplish his goal. There are four modes of discourse. The first one is narrative or narration. Narration is text told through time. It's a story. So anytime, if you've ever heard of a presentation and the author begins with some kind of personal story or anecdote, that people like stories, and so that's usually a really good way to engage somebody. So stories are used all the time. If you think about Preston's book, he's certainly using narration because he's telling the story of the expedition. From hearing about T1 to getting involved in the project, to using LiDAR, to finding T1, to organizing the expedition, to going in the jungle, and then we're about to get into the whole aftermath of all of that. So narration is text to tell a story. Next is description. This is text that uses sensory detail, and you can see on the slide that jargony phrase you may not know, which is a dominant impression. So when we think of description, you should be thinking of an author using all of your five senses in order to help you understand what they're looking at, what they're hearing, what they're tasting, what they're smelling, what they're touching, right? So using sensory detail. One of my favorite essays that I actually use in freshman comp to teach them description is an essay that a student wrote about her father. And the essay, starts very specific, and she describes what he looks like. Her father has psoriasis, which is kind of a rash, and the skin gets real flaky, so she describes that first. But her dominant impression, which is that term, is that she finds her father disgusting, and not just in how he looks, but in the way he eats. She zooms out a little bit and talks about him eating, and then she talks about his apartment, and she describes all the moldy food and dirty dishes and dirty clothes that are laying around, and the cigarette butts and the ashtray. And so you get this real sense of him living in a disgusting way. And then she zooms out more and ends the essay with an anecdote. So here's some narration where she tells the story of a time where the way he treated her was very disgusting. And she tells a story. Now, a dominant impression is your overall feeling or impression of something. So when I teach this in comp, I use the Minnesota State Fair. And I talk about how before they revised the bus entrance to the fair, it used to be that you entered on this bridge, that you walked over this bridge over the road, and you could look down. You were pretty high at that point, and you could see the whole fair. And so I would say if you can picture yourself standing on that bridge looking at the fair, it brought you in at about the Miracle of Life barn. And if you could just give me an overall impression of what you're seeing. So I said, on the first day of the fair, maybe the temperature's really cool and your dominant impression is, oh my gosh, Martha's cookies smell so good, or something like that. And then maybe if you went to the fair on a really hot day and it's later in the fair, you'd be standing on that bridge, you're right by the Miracle of Life barn, and you might be thinking, it stinks. Or if you show up at one of the times for a really big concert, maybe you're thinking, oh my gosh, it's crowded, right? So a dominant impression is your overall general feeling or thought about what you're looking at, what you're seeing, what you're smelling, what you're hearing. It's what you're about to describe. So in this father essay, the student started with, my father's hands are disgusting. But see, then while she described his hands first, she did zoom out and you understood that she really just thinks her father is disgusting. And so that's a dominant impression. And then description, like I said, uses sensory detail, how something looks, how it sounds, how it smells, how it feels, how it tastes, in order to describe that. So that's description. If you think about the Monkey God book, Preston does use a lot of description. Think about when he first arrived in the jungle and how he described the howler monkeys and how they sounded. A lot of figurative language is used in description because you're doing a lot of comparing. The howler monkey sounded like a machine winding up, right? So that helps you understand what he was hearing. That's all description. Okay, the next mode of discourse is exposition. And exposition is text that's written to inform you or explain something. And so this is like your textbook kind of writing, writing that is not there to entertain you. It's not there to describe something. It's not there to tell a story. It is there to teach you something. So expository text is text that's supposed to teach you about something by informing and or explaining. Preston does this also in the Monkey God book. If you think about when he had to teach you about LiDAR, if you remember, we took chapter 11. Actually, I had copied the first page of it, and we kind of grouped the text into these different modes. So you have heard this before, but if you remember, he started teaching you about LiDAR. There are 3 types of LiDAR, and then he went into it and how it worked. That's expository writing. Last, you have persuasion, and persuasive text is text that's supposed to convince you of something. If you think of the Raff article, she was trying to convince you that the way Douglas Preston wrote about the expedition was wrong because it was sensationalist, right? That's persuasion, trying to convince somebody. Now, again, you'll see these modes again when you get to freshman comp next semester. I know in my freshman composition course, we actually start out in narration, and I teach students how to tell a good story, and we actually incorporate description at that time, because one of the ways to tell a good story is to describe what's happening. And then we move into an expository essay, and we end the semester in persuasion. So you'll see these again, and you'll see them more in the slide or in this presentation later on. Okay, so next we talk about a claim. Now you know this concept also, because a claim is just the thesis statement. It's the main idea. It's what they're trying to get across. It's where they're coming from. Another word for this is point of view, right? And so I say on this slide that claim can be synonymous. In other words, synonyms for claim are main idea and thesis. And so we've been using these terms all semester. This should not surprise you. And you heard of claims when we did rhetorical analysis, and you realized that was the thesis statement. So I feel like you probably are okay with this slide. Okay, so next is author's tone. So when you think of tone, you're thinking of the way someone sounds. Now, this is really easy when someone is speaking to you, because you can hear their tone of voice. Do they sound happy? Do they sound sad? Do they sound angry? I always tell the story that, as a mom, I can call my children from, if I'm in the kitchen, and I can yell up the stairs. And the way that I call them usually tells them how fast to run. If I'm yelling to them because I'm angry, I'm going to sound differently than if I'm calling them just down for dinner, right? And so as a listener, we can hear somebody talking and understand how they're feeling. That's a little harder when we get to essays and writing because that's an inference you have to make. Well, it's an inference before, but it's much easier with the sound of someone's voice. And so you have to instead rely on connotation of words, how words sound, right? Like, so if we think of connotation and denotation, so denotation is just the dictionary definition of a word. If I call someone a child, I just mean a young person. That word doesn't mean anything other than child, right? So child is a very denotative word. But if I'm writing about children and I call a child in the essay a brat, that word brat has a very negative connotation. And so you could infer from that if I used the word brat, I was upset or I was angry. So the connotation of a word suggests that I am feeling subjective about something, which means I'm judgmental, I'm upset, I have an emotion towards it, versus me feeling objective if I use the word child. Right? What if I use the word angel or baby or kiddo? Those words are more positively connotated, and so then you could infer that I was happy or proud or just feeling much better than if I used the word brat. Okay? So very denotative words or lack of connotative words helps you understand that a writer might be feeling very objective towards something, but if they use a lot of words that sound really angry or mad or upset, then you can infer that they're feeling very subjective towards something and they're judging it and they're very emotional towards it. So tone is all about how does the author feel about their topic. And again, you use word choices and you look at the connotation of those words. Are they positive, negative, or neutral? And that helps you to infer how the author feels. Okay, so tone is all about their voice and how they sound. But again, in writing, that's hard, so we rely on the length of sentences as well as word choices. Okay. Tone supports purpose. In other words, if I'm trying to persuade you to do something, and let's say I'm really angry about it, then my emotions are going to reflect that in the words that I pick. So I'm going to be using words that help you know that I'm angry because, again, I'm trying to convince you of something. I want you on my side. And so therefore, you're going to infer how I feel. It's much easier to persuade someone to do something if you're emotional about it. That's why if you think of the rhetorical analysis stuff that we did, Pathos is going to be your golden ticket. If you can get someone to react emotionally to something, then you've got them. If you've ever listened to a presentation and someone launched into, well, let me tell you about this study, and they start launching into facts and statistics and boring stuff that your brain goes, ugh, right? Well, that's objective writing, right, to give you all the facts, but it's not as interesting. And so it's less likely to persuade you. Now, that kind of writing is very appropriate if we use expository writing, right? But in persuasive writing, it wouldn't be a good idea. So subjective writing uses words that are highly connotative to create emotional states. That should make sense to you now. You should be going, oh yeah, persuasive writing is going to make me care and use words so that I get mad or I get upset, right? Mood, mind, willingness to act, right? You've got to change their mood before you can change their mind. And the best way to do that is with pathos, okay? Which is all emotion. Objective writing uses words without many connotations because it's more expository, it's more neutral. It's just trying to inform or explain. Okay, that should make sense, I hope, to you. Okay, next, bias. We talk about bias with this idea of a slant, and that's another way to look at something. So bias sounds negative, right? It sounds like you're narrow-minded and prejudiced towards something if you walk into something with a bias, right? A couple years ago, I had a student in one of my composition classes write an article about, she's writing about abortion, right? And depending on how religiously or morally I feel about that, I could enter that essay with a bias. I could walk in and say, I feel this way. I am very pro-life about abortion. And so therefore I'm going to have a hard time listening if you're pro-choice. Or conversely, if I'm very much a pro-choice person, if someone wrote a pro-life stance, I might have a hard time with that, right? And so that suggests that I can't put my own feelings aside and consider someone's argument, right? So bias does sound negative because it is wrapped up in emotion, okay? And point of view, however, sounds more thoughtful and open. And so if you say, well, here's my point of view on this, but I can separate myself, well, then that's a good thing. All right, so we're gonna talk more about bias in the next couple slides. So when we think of objective writing, we're thinking very straightforward. We're going to use denotative words. We're just telling it like it is. We're straightforward, okay? And so then this line, you can see the line is straight, right? And so that's very objective text, okay? Denotative words, not a lot of angry words or sad words or happy words. You're just going to be using child, right? Very denotative words. Okay. Now, if you enter an essay and you have a bias, then you are either towards something or against it. So like I said, let's say that I was very much pro-choice, okay? Then I have a bias. I have a slant. I'm towards women's rights and I'm against people who don't feel that way, right? So conversely, let's say I was very much pro-life, then I would be towards, right, the baby, or that I would be towards feeling like a fetus is a baby, but I would be slanted away from those reproductive rights, okay? And so it's all about that slant of the line. This helps give you a visual on that. If the line is slanted, then you can see we're going to be using very connotative word choices because we're towards something and we're against something, okay? I'm going to give you an example here with the RAF article in just a minute, but hopefully that makes sense. When you have a bias, it means you are entering the text with a slant, right? Like let's say, for example, you just went to a really wonderful restaurant, okay? And you wanted to write a review on Yelp or Facebook or something, right? When you wrote that review, if you had a really good experience, then you would be slanted towards the restaurant, right? And away from saying that it's bad. And so then your slant, you would use that slant, or you would have that slant as you wrote the review. You'd probably use really connotative word choices about how wonderful it was. Just the same as if you had a bias and let's say you had a really bad experience, and then you would write your review with a slant towards how awful they were and away from the restaurant, okay? So that's all bias. Okay. Now, I know that fact versus opinion is a very straightforward concept. You learned it in elementary school. We know that facts can be verified and opinions can't. And so that is a real easy way to think about it. But this concept, just like all the other ones we've talked about this semester, gets much harder when the text is hard. And so we will look at that as we move into some of these harder texts. Okay, now I want you to know that it's all interconnected. Again, that's why I had you get your blue sheet out and your rhetorical analysis worksheet out, because you should understand that a bias influences the words you use. If you use highly connotative words, that affects your tone, right? Now, that only is okay if your main purpose is to persuade and your claim is trying to convince someone of something, right? But you can see conversely, if your purpose is just exposition and all you're trying to do is teach somebody, then your claim would be very neutral, you would lack a bias, and so your tone would be very objective. So please make sure that you understand how interconnected these terms are. All right. So let's look at the RAF article. It'd probably be a good idea at this point to pause the presentation. You might want to reread the RAF article. Make sure you remember it. Make sure it's fresh in your head so that this, me taking this essay through these 4 concepts makes sense to you in a much better way. All right, so pause if you need to. Make sure you reread the article and look at your blue sheet, your rhetorical analysis worksheet, because then this will be very easy. Okay, we're going to move on. Let's first talk about purpose. Remember, modes of discourse, author's purpose, narration, description, exposition, persuasion. So you want to think about Raph's purpose. What is she setting out to do? Now, we have what's called mixed modes of discourse because she has more than one purpose here. Her predominant purpose is to persuade. It's persuasion. She wants you to be on her side, that Begley and Joyce and the scholars are right and archaeology is exciting on its own, and you don't have to use sensationalist tactics about something that's already really cool. Remember, she wants to convince you that Preston and the way he wrote about T1 or the Ciudad Blanca is wrong, okay? And so that is what she's trying to convince you, right? Mood, mind, willingness to act. Right? She wants Preston to act better when he writes about it. And so she's trying to convince us, first make us mad at him, and then change our mind about the way archaeology should be written about. So the predominant mode of discourse of Raph's essay is persuasion. Now, in order to accomplish that goal, she uses exposition also because she has to inform and explain about Ciudad Blanca, right? The history of it. Preston's article, she has to tell you what happened in case you weren't up on that whole thing, right? So she's got to tell you what Preston wrote about. She's got to talk about Begley and colonialist attitudes to convince you of what Preston did was wrong. So she's got to inform and explain some things. And what you're going to find is that all persuasive essays have elements of exposition in them too. You cannot convince someone of something without also teaching them what you're talking about. So these often go together. Now, if you think of the Begley article, that one had narration and description in it too, in order to convince you that Begley is a real-life Indiana Jones. They had to tell some stories of him being in the jungle and running from outlaws, right? Because that story helped to convince you that he's like Indiana Jones. So remember, it's all about purpose and how you accomplish that, okay? All right. Next is claim. You already know the claim because it's on your blue sheet under main idea and under your rhetorical analysis worksheet under claim. National Geographic and writers like Douglas Preston can write about sensational finds without sensationalist tactics. Writing well about good science is more than enough. Archaeology is exciting on its own without invoking ugly tropes in order to sell ratings. There's the claim. There's the main idea. You already knew that. All right, next is tone. Now, what I've done on this slide is I've tried to circle the different connotative word choices in paragraph 11 specifically, just because it had so many. So if you could look in your essay, please, at paragraph 11, look at some of the word choices I've pulled. Now, I've also color-coded it. So the purple, words that are circled in purple are really positive words, and then the words that are circled in like that goldy orange color are negative, right? So look at the ones I circled in purple. You have highly effective. That sounds good, right? That's positive. If something is highly effective, that's good. Convenient, people like convenient things, so that's also good. A sense of wonder is all really good too. Excitement is good. And then she says genuinely exciting archaeological work. That's also a positive phrase. Okay, so she's got some positive stuff in here, and most of it's at the beginning, right? So when it comes to real world archaeology, the Lost City trope is highly effective and convenient. It draws out the shared sense of wonder and excitement among viewers. Okay. Now, then she's acknowledging that there's some good things about the trope. It's going to sell. And remember, when we talked about Preston in this article, he's a writer. He's a writer for National Geographic. National Geographic is going to be happy if because of this article you buy their magazine. And Preston's going to be happy if because of this article you buy his book, right? They're trying to sell something. So the fact that it's highly effective is exactly what Preston and National Geographic were relying on. And so that's what they did, right? And so she's acknowledging, yep, I bet it did work. And you know that it did because that Nat Geo article was one of the most downloaded ones on the National Geographic site like ever, right? So it did work. So she's acknowledging that, right? And then she turns, right? Unfortunately, which is negative, fabrication is bad, blatantly inaccurate, bad, cross over the line, bad, misleading portrait, bad, hype, negative, worse, negative, pretending is bad, indigenous people don't count is bad, legacy of colonialism is bad. So you can see where she's talking about all of the bad things associated with selling ratings, right? And so you can see that she's angry, blatantly inaccurate, sounds really mad, right? Fabrication as lies. And so she's calling it lies and hype, and all of those things are bad, right? So you can see the negative words in here and how that helps you understand how angry Raph is and how angry she wants you to be at what Douglas Preston did. You should be reacting to this paragraph and going, oh man, Preston did all that just to sell books. That's kind of lame, right? That's how she wants you to feel. Okay. Now, tone continued. Because of all the highly connotative words in that paragraph, we can tell that Raph is very much subjective, right? And then I've given you some other examples here that aren't in paragraph 11, because, you know, it wasn't just paragraph 11 where you can tell her tone. She sounds confident because she thinks she's right. If we were going to have her how she sounds, like her tone of voice, and if she was reading this to you, you can say, wow, she really believes what she's saying. She thinks she's right about it, okay? She shames Preston. It's like she's saying, shame on you, Preston. Here's some examples. Paragraph 2. When she says, but according to Douglas Preston, yes, that Douglas Preston, here she's making fun of him. She's like, yeah, that guy, the guy that wrote Relic Hunter, that guy, right? She's making fun of him at that point. Okay, paragraph 6, when she says, but there's one slight problem. By the way, slight is a huge understatement. The lost city is anything but lost. In fact, it's just one site, and probably not even the largest of many in a region that's been considered for millennia and has been occupied, and well studied by archaeologists. How well studied? According to a group of scholars who have actually studied the region. So here, she's accusing the expedition in Preston of not studying at all. And so you can hear that scorn in her voice there. Now, paragraph 7, she's talking about Begley here. Remember, she likes Begley. She wants us on Begley and her side. There's a website created and maintained by Dr. Christopher Begley, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the archaeology of the region, devoted to making archaeological findings from here accessible to the interested public. There's even a frickin' Wikipedia entry on this mythical site. Now, that sentence is full of scorn. It's like, well, if there's a Wikipedia site on it, of course it's known. Of course it's been studied, right? Because she's assuming that if there's a Wikipedia site on it, then people know about it, right? So all of that is shaming Preston. You stink. You wrote the Relic Hunter. We don't like you. You didn't do your research. You don't know anything, okay? She uses sarcasm in paragraph 5 when she's reacting to Preston's article. She says, not just a lost city, an entire lost civilization. Amazing. Fortunately, National Geographic had camera crews on hand for this discovery and put together a National Geographic Explorer program. So here, she doesn't mean that. That's all sarcasm, right? Sarcasm is when you say the opposite of what you mean. Here, she doesn't think it's amazing. And she doesn't think she says it's, fortunately, she's not fortunate they had camera crews on hand to document it and put it online. She doesn't think any of that's good. So she's using sarcasm because she's angry. Now, she sounds baffled and angry also. Look at paragraph 8. Here she's reacting again to some of the word choices in Preston's article, where she says, it's after all those lost city, vanished, never before explored. Those are all words from Preston's article. And she says, never before explored, lost, uninhabited region. You can hear her yelling by the last one. And look at all the question marks there. You can really tell that she is angry. So again, how can you tell tone? It's through word choice and sentence structure, okay? You can hear the sarcasm, the scorn, and how angry she is. I also want you to notice here on this slide how specific I was about tone. Make sure when you are doing this same concept and you're looking at the 2 Columbus articles, which is going to be your assignment, for these concepts that you are just as specific. I want quotes with paragraph numbers, please. Okay, is Raph biased? Bias is a yes or no question. They're either yes biased or no they're not. So yes, she is. right? Because subjective language and that emotion helps you know that she has a slant. She is coming into this article. She hated Preston from the beginning and she wrote like she hated him, okay? So it's biased towards. You have to figure out then towards and against, right? So she's biased towards Begley and Joyce and real archaeology, right? Because she thinks it's sensational all on its own. It doesn't need all the hype of all those Lost City tropes, right? And then she's biased against National Geographic, Preston, and Adventures, which is what she calls the Expeditioners. Okay, so when you answer the question about bias, it's a yes or no answer, and you should be able to understand what they're biased towards and what they're biased against. Okay. Now it's your turn. So I've taken the RAF article through all 4 concepts. You can see the questions there. Those 4 questions are what you're answering on your own paper. So you should be typing this up. You should take those 4 questions through Christopher Columbus is No Hero. And then you should do the same 4 questions again for the icon article. Okay? What is the author's purpose? Make sure you tell me what the mode of discourse is, and make sure you tell me how you know that. You want to say, I know it's narration or I know it's exposition because of X, right? Make sure you explain. What is the author's claim? You know that should come straight from your blue sheet. You've already done that. What is the author's tone? Please be as specific as I was. I want to see word choices. I want to see phrases. I want to understand your understanding of connotative word choices and that subjective language, okay? Bias is a yes or no answer. They're either biased yes or biased no. And then I want you to tell me what they're towards and what they're against. Now, when you're done, you're just answering these 4 questions for one article and then doing the same 4 questions for the other. Make sure, I don't care which one you do first, so just make sure you put the text title at the top, right? You can do them on the same document and then upload it to the assignment folder when you are done. All right, that's it for this part of academic language. Please let me know if you have any questions and have fun with the assignment. Thanks.